يعرف ديباش على لشوني خليبانا خليبانا عربوا لي شيره غيونك تصحي لي شير ورنانا عتى أمير لخزي منيخ أحاربي لو تقعدنا شوشنا أغدل سيسوني شوشنا رعنانا صبعت نود بمدينوف وبمدبار ميلون أرحيم حصل منوحات شأنانوف ومشكينوف مبطاحيم أترع يا ذي بين
good evening, morning, etc. To everyone. I must say how glad I am to see old friends and colleagues, some of whom I haven't seen for quite a number of years, and that warms my heart. I'm particularly delighted to be taking part in this event celebrating the launch of Dr. Merav Rosenfeld-Hadad's important new book, Judaism and Islam, One God, One Music, of the Paraliturgical song in the context of Arabo culture, as revealed in its Jewish Babylonian sources. I should note there are a number of reasons why I am delighted. I've followed with interest Dr. Rosenfeld-Hadad's work from the time completed her doctoral dissertation, and we've taken part in a number of conferences in several countries together, and have contributed to a few volumes of collected studies as well, the most recent of which is Jewish Muslim Religions, Past and Present, a Kaleidoscopic View, edited by my former student, Joseph Yusuf Meri, which appeared just 4 years ago. I'm also delighted because this event and taking place, well, at least virtually, at Gurion University, with its vibrant program in Middle Eastern Studies and its significant forum, which was already mentioned, on the history and culture of Jews and Christians in the Muslim world, which I had the honor of speaking at its launching several years ago. This is all the more important since, unfortunately, some of the older Israeli universities have allowed their programs on Islamicate Jewry to shrink over the past few years through attrition. And having sat on the Biton Commission, where we gave advice to the Ministry of Education on how to, what needs to be done to improve this. It's sad to see that some universities have not followed the same path as Gurion. Merav Rosenfeld-Hadad's in-depth study sheds light on several aspects of the intricately interwoven ties of Jewish and Islamic culture in the Arabo-Islamic world, and more specifically, within the context of Islamic civilization. Now, it's become a commonplace to refer to the nearly millennium and a half of the cultural interaction between Judaism and Islam and between Jews and Muslims by the biological metaphor of symbiosis, a term popularized by my master and teacher, Shlomo Dov Goitheim, in his book, Jews and Arabs, Their Contacts Through the Ages. However, the idea itself goes back to the Wissenschafts des Judentums of the 19th century, the founding fathers of modern Judaic studies. But since symbiosis can be characterized either by a parasitic or a commensal form of mutualism, I prefer to describe the interrelationship by the term commensality, which not only implies living together in a shared environment, like the Spanish convivencia coined by Americo Castro and often used by historians of Islamic Iberia, Al-Andalus or Sefarad. Like commensality, convivencia also at its Latin root indicates sharing the same table. Only in this case, we're talking about a table of culture and not of comestibles. This shared table of culture harkens back to the very birth and formation of Islam in the 7th century in Arabia. A considerable corpus of the religious concepts, ethical notions, homiletic lore, and scriptural topoi were absorbed into the Prophet Muhammad's religious message from Jewish, Christian, and perhaps Judeo-Christian sources. And while we cannot, with any certainty, always identify the sources as Jewish or Christian, there is still much that is specifically and identifiably of Jewish origin in early Islam. A great body of extra-Quranic lore, that's unfortunately for those of you who are not familiar with it, New York accent, I can't differentiate between L-O-R-E and L-A-W. But in any case, in Jewish and Islamic lore, there is a great deal that comprise of the extra-Quranic lore, which comprises an important part of Muslim scriptural exegesis, of tafsir al-Quran, and of prophetic hagiography, qisas al-anbiya, which is actually called Israeliyat, that is, Israelite narratives. And there was among some Muslim religious authorities in early Islam the sentiment that the borrowing or sharing of religio-cultural material could be permissible in some cases. And this is embodied in the oft-quoted saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad himself, حدثوا عن بني إسرائيل ولا حرج. Relate traditions that come from the children of Israel and do it without scruples, no guilt feelings. I would hasten to note that the notion of permissible cultural and religious sharing has its counterpart in Rabbi Ovadia Yosef's ruling that Arabic music may be adapted for liturgical and paraliturgical Jewish use, which Dr. Rosenfeld-Hadad has discussed in detail in her essay in Joseph Merry's edited volume, which I mentioned just a few moments ago, and to which Hayes Portas also made allusion. Among the important factors that contributed to this cultural commensality between Jews and Muslims in Islamic society is that Islam did not totally reject Judaism as did Christianity. It did not see itself as being the true fulfillment of Judaism as did Christianity. And it never branded Judaism with the odium theologicum, the divine hatred that Christianity did. Nor did Judaism perceive Islam as idolatrous, as avodah zarah, which is the way that it did perceive Christianity. And actually, in his famous, both his and his father's, Maimonides' famous Igeret al Kiddush Hashem, or Igeret Hashmad, which was written at the time of the sectarian, non-Orthodox Muslim Almohad forced conversion of Jews in North Africa and Spain, the choice of conversion or death. He argued against Jewish scholars in the Christian world who said that anyone who did this had lost their place in the world to come. And he goes on to say, because this is not one of the three Yeḥezqel Bal Yavor, that they should die rather than transgress, but rather that Islam was not idolatry in the sense of Christianity. And of course, if one could practice Judaism in secret, all the better. And when one could, go to where one could openly return to the practice of Judaism. Now, the linguistic acculturation, that is Arabization, was far easier in the Middle East, I would point out. Arabic replaced Aramaic, which was a cognate language, and was the previous lingua franca of both Jews and Gentiles in the area of the Levant. I would also note that Aramaic had already been used for all purposes, both religious and profane, and therefore the transition to Arabic seemed a natural process affecting everyone, irrespective of their ethnicity or their religious confession. Not only did the kinship of Arabic to Hebrew and Aramaic mitigate against any feeling of foreignness, but also the prestige of Arabic in Islamic society, which has a veritable cult of language. This had a psychological impact on Islamicate Jewry. And lastly, there was a secular aspect of general Islamic culture for which Arabic was the medium and could safely be shared. And of course, there was nothing of this sort in the clerical society of medieval Europe. Arabic came to be not only the spoken language of Jews in its Judeo-Arabic form, that is, as in most diasporas, Jews wrote whatever language they adopted, normally in Hebrew characters, and with an addition of Hebrew cultural and religious terms. But it was the primary written language, even in the religious domain. Shelot u'tshuvot, queries and responsa, biblical commentaries, parshanut, ethical literature, and of course, philosophy and theology. All of this was done in Arabic. And even grammars and dictionaries of the Hebrew language were written in Arabic. But that brings us to the fact that the two hymnals that constitute the primary source for the Piyyutim discussed by Dr. Rosenfeld-Hadad may be called Masahif, which is Arabic, but the poetry in their contents is overwhelmingly Hebrew. And here we come to another aspect of the what I call the commensality, and that is the psycho-cultural aesthetic aspect. Arabic has the highest prestige in Islamic society. And from the Muslim perspective, it is Lughat Allah wa Mala'ikihi. It is the language of God and his angels. And furthermore, poetry, shi'r, is the supreme art form in Arab society. But for Jews, Hebrew is Lashon Kodesh. It is the holy language, literally the language of holiness. And in culture, Jewish poetry, whether religious or secular, remained almost exclusively in Hebrew within Islamic society, all the way up throughout history to modern times. And Dunash ben Labrat, at the Majlis of the courtly salon of Hasna ibn Shaprut in mid-10th century Cordoba, as Dr. Rosenfeld-Hadad rightly notes, although he introduced the innovation of adapting Arabic rhyme and meter to Hebrew poetry, which became standardized henceforth in the Sephardi world, even as it goes into Christian Spain, and later on in Turkey and so on, this remains the standard for prosody for all of Hebrew poetry. But the poetry was in Hebrew, and not only was it in Hebrew, but in puristic biblical Hebrew, replacing the Mishnaic Hebrew of the post-biblical Piyyut genre. And here again, one can see the sophisticated, delicate influence of the Arab thought on language and language purity in the relationship to this new form of Hebrew poetry. The Andalusian poet and translator Yehuda al-Harizi, who died around 1235, starts off in Spain, comes to the Middle East, states quite candidly that he composed his Tahkamoni, which is patterned after the highly esteemed collection of picaresque tales in rhymed Arabic prose of al-Hariri, in order, and I quote, to show the power of the holy language to the holy people. The psychological and cultural values and the technical framework of the genre are part and parcel of Arabo-Islamic culture, but the manifestation is Jewish. Dr. Rosenfeld-Hadad's book deals with the combined, and of course, I should say, we're on a first name basis, but one of the things years ago that bothered me in Israel, although it's getting better now, is that female colleagues were always addressed by their first name or referred to by their first name, whereas male colleagues were Dr. So-and-so, Professor so-and-so, and so on. So I have made it a strict rule to refer to you by your well-earned title. Dr. Rosenfeld-Hadad's book deals with the combined phenomenon of poetry and music. And I certainly would not be so presumptuous to talk about the musicological aspects of the book or of music in the commensality of Islamic and Jewish civilization, knowing that the next speaker is my old friend and respected colleague, Professor Mark Kligman. This is not I may appreciate music, but it is not my forte academically. Although I just might add that the Jews in the Islamic world have played, and here I'm doing this now as a cultural historian, have played an important role in its musical culture. And this goes back to the early Middle Ages. The great compiler of Andalusian cultural history, Al-Maqri, relates in his magnum opus, Nafh al-Tib, that a Jew by the name of Abu Nasr Mansur was the court musician of the Umayyad Amir al-Hakam I in Cordoba at the end of the 8th and the first quarter of the 9th century. And that it was through Abu Nasr's efforts that the famous Persian singer Ziryab was brought from Baghdad to Cordoba, where, as it's well known, he became the arbiter dictum of social canons and tastes at the court of Abdurrahman II, who succeeded al-Hakam to the throne of Islamic Spain. Jewish musicians from Spain, I remember this first was brought to my attention by another beloved teacher, Samuel Miklos Stern, who came to the United States as a visitor, and with whom I studied Andalusian poetry. That Jewish musicians from Spain, because the poetry, of course, was all sung in performance, that these musicians brought qananish, notebooks of muwashah and zajal poetry to Morocco, following various expulsions, and of course culminating in the Great Expulsion of 1492. And of course, Jewish musicians played for Muslim audiences from Morocco to Iraq, all the way down to modern times. And I would just point out, because at least my view of this symbiosis, this commensality, is from a shared table of culture, there is a good deal that we say comes from the Jews or comes from the Muslims that actually were part of the ancient Near Eastern and ancient North African and Iberian cultures, which were then adapted reformed, of course, in various ways. And I would just point out as an example, today, anyone who knows and studies Arabic proverbs knows that the proverbs people use are not the proverbs you would find in Al-Maidani's Amthal al-Arab, the great classical Arab poet. Yes, if you're very learned in classical Arabic, you may use occasionally. But as has been shown by a number of scholars, including Professor Gurion, the proverbs you find in the Arab world today, again, from Morocco across to Iraq, are in fact the proverbs of the ancient Near East that have been translated into Arabic, that were absorbed into the culture. And I will end with a question that I have, or at least a challenge, and a good challenge to Professor Rosenfeld-Hadad, that perhaps, and of course this would be something for your next book, could it be found that some of these musical traditions were in fact already in place in what anyone who knows Arabic music, at least from listening to it, knows there's a big difference between Moroccan Andalusian Arabic music, what's called Andalusian music in Turkey, and the music of Syria, Iraq, and so on. I was just in this past weekend a Moroccan synagogue where the music, which was the music, the chant, the cantillation was all 100. I felt I was back in Morocco. And could it be that there are elements in these musical traditions that in fact come in from this culture, this huge geographical expanse of culture in which Arabs were the dominant, certainly the dominant factor. Jews were part of the population, but could some of it also have been there to begin with? And I will leave it as that. I certainly can't answer it, but there's something for a historian musicologist. And congratulations on the appearance of the book, which I enjoyed immensely and learned a great deal from.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's an honor to hear you.
Thank you very much, Professor Stillman. It is always great pleasure to hear you, to see you, and I hope you will have in the future another opportunities to invite you here and see you and hear you again. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Greetings, and for me, it's morning. I hope you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. And I am so appreciative for this wonderful invitation to our hosts at Gurion University. And just to say, as Noam Stillman did before, it's great to see you. It's great to see people I haven't seen in a long time. You're always my teacher. Your books always come off the shelf anytime that I teach or write. And it's always a pleasure to hear you. And also to Yeḥezqel Zion, Hazan Yeḥezqel Zion. I spent many years studying at his congregation at Bet Torah in Brooklyn. And I just, when I see you, just the memory of hearing you beautifully sing the tefillot comes to mind. Your recordings are ones I always use, I still use in my classes that I teach. So it's so good to see you and wish you well. And we look forward to hearing you, which means I should be very short because music we should listen to, not necessarily talk about.
Thank you.
Most importantly, my congratulations to Merav Rosenfeld-Hadad. If you don't mind the endearing Merav, I'll just refer to you as Merav because you're such a dear colleague. It's so wonderful to see you at the international conferences that I go to. We've now sit on panels together as experts in this field that not a lot of people study. And we have so many shared interests in Judeo-Arab music and how it really integrates with tefillah. And it's really an honor. Thank you for asking me and just to be here to really celebrate your book. And I just want to say that in the world of Jewish music and musicology, this is a very special and very, very important book. There are very few books written on this subject, particularly in English. And to really be a contribution, to have this book as a contribution to the field of music, the field of Jewish music, and also to Jewish studies. Jewish studies, of course, which is very historically and text-driven, doesn't spend as much time and energy on music, although that's beginning to change. But to really have that integrated view of Jewish studies and music is so important because it shows in the Jewish studies context how important music could be. So what I'd like to do is just talk about some of these key aspects of the book and share with you some ideas and reflect on my experience with the Aleppo or Halabi community and really show how these practices are integrated and offer some other comments. I want to start off with Noam's idea. We've, for me, for decades, have always been working on the Goitan, Bernard Lewis kind of idea of Judeo-Arab synthesis. And that's just kind of something that many of us really still use. So I really love Noam's idea of the commensality and convivencia, because that actually is a much better idea, because synthesis means it comes from one place and another place and it really gets synthesized. And the ideas that I really want to share is just that it's, I think, hard to identify ownership of a lot of these traits, that these are, just shared practices that get manifested in different ways. And it's not only true of this context of the Iraqi Jews of, in Baghdad, in their history, but I could also say the same for Eastern European Jewish traditions, German Jewish traditions. I mean, this is just something that's the commonality really for Jewish culture. So I'm just going to share my screen for just a couple of quick examples. This very important text, I don't really know Arabic that well, so Mitzchaf, or our Shirim, Sefer Shirim Tehilot, is the important essence of the work that Merav is really working on. And one of the most important things to really say at the very outset is that text and music is very hard to detangle. They're so attached to each other. And that's what's so important about this, this practice. And that the compilation that's in this book really represents this textual tradition, in some cases from its history in the initial publication in 1906, from its pre-migratory experiences, which really shows its history, and that there is really represents in the 1954 publication, After the Community Comes to Israel, this growing body of literature and how the expressions continues and how it is in conversation with other related traditions. And Merav demonstrates this beautifully in this particular table. In this particular table, what we see listed is the number of poems based upon particular authors and also region. And we see the very important historic layer, a lot of which Noam Stillman already talked about Dunish ben Labrat. We can see that once we get further down on the left-hand side into the Ottoman era, the very famous Israel ben Mosheh Ḥabushah. Ḥabushah is a very important figure in the whole circle of Piyyutim and its connection to music. And Merav spends just a great deal of time talking about Ḥabushah, and Ḥabushah is just always sort of like coming up because his songs are really constantly sung. But if you look at the right-hand side and you can see the other traditions of the other editions, we can see that North Africa becomes a very important influence from the 16th and the 17th century, the Ottoman influence through the 17th and 18th century. And we can even see that there's an important influence a little later on of the Halab or the Aleppo or Syrian or even the Egyptian tradition. And those traditions are often hard to completely detangle. But we see that there's a circulation of some poetry that is a part of this tradition that really is a very shared entity. And of course, we want to see that about half of this new material, as you can see on the right-hand side, actually comes from the local tradition of Baghdad. But just as we locate this tradition in Baghdad, there's also this aspect that it's a representation of a larger region. It's a representation on the shared commonality of practice, which is a very, very important thing to mention in this particular context of looking at this music. As Noam said, I just want to further underscore the real importance of orality, the real importance of language. And language is, in some ways, the art supreme. If you look in the Renaissance era, dance is really important. Within this region of the world, verbal art, the performance of verbal art is really the most important, the highly valued art. Memorization of words, the retelling of words, both in the religious tradition and other related traditions, are so important. And Merav spends a lot of time in this book really unpacking that for us and really underscoring the beauty of the words, the lyricism that's found in the text, and the analytical approach that she takes to really look at the rhyme scheme and the meter, the way that the words just flow as words, irrespective of music, are really important aspects of just the formation of the Hebrew. So the creation of the Hebrew itself is its own art form, a very important art form, but it's not an art form that is just about the words. It's about how these words sound, the assonance of the sound. And at least in some of the work that I've done with the Syrian community, really looking at how there's a borrowed tradition of how often they're modeling an Arabic song, and they take the sound, the assonance of the originating Arabic song, and put that into the sound and the meaning of newly created Pismon in the Syrian context. It's just really important to remember that this is its own artistic contribution of how this is working as a verbal art. The content of these songs, of course, are about focusing on praising God, the essence of God. And what's so beautiful about this poetry is that some of it I find almost untranslatable, where you just have to kind of think about concepts, about astrological, ideas, about, the Sfirot. There's a lot of mysticism. A lot of this, I think, is just like not fully, comprehensible, but I think that that's the purpose, is to be lost in the imagery of the words, what the words mean and what they are. And I think that's all part of the practice, is that it's a matter of gaining that essence, both in a figurative and a literal sense, and the music is very important to that. So Merav makes a really wonderful statement throughout the book that there's really no halakhically driven practice for the way in which this musical practice of paraliturgical songs work. It's not halakhically driven like we have for tefillah or for saying a bracha. And she over and over emphasizes the flexibility of the practice. There are personal expressions that are really involved in how communities, individuals create their own practice, how people can sing that music. It's very common to sing this music in the Syrian tradition as well as the Iraqi tradition in the synagogue, in between aliyot for the Torah, or sometimes they might take a break on Rosh Hashanah or on the Yamim Noraim or the Shalosh Regalim, where they might sing Piyyutim after Shacharit before the Torah service. That I found, as someone who grew up, completely 100% Ashkenaz, just to be a fascinating and beautiful practice of how this music and poetry can be articulated in a very flexible way. The songs are sung on particular occasions, and Merav spends a lot of time talking about the interconnectedness between the different publications of the book and the different occasions of these songs. And it's always just fascinating to sort of see where there are commonalities among these traditions and what's really very local. So we see this as a particular practice of the Moroccan tradition and the Moroccan tradition of the Iraqi tradition, and how the Iraqi tradition is unfolding it in these ways. I want to now spend my time talking about music, which is my charge here. And one of the things to really say about Iraqi music, at least in modernity, is that the Iraqi Jews are very significant in Iraq for being musicians. In Aleppo, that wasn't the case. In Aleppo, many of the Jews were the patrons of music, the connoisseurs of music, not necessarily the makers of music. This varies in Iran, it varies in Morocco, but particularly in Iraq, the Jews were the musicians, and they say when all the Jews were leaving in 50 and 52 to go to Israel out of Baghdad, that the Baghdad orchestra had to close down for a short period of time because they were looking for more musicians. So this is a really key feature about Iraqi musicians. And there are very similar stories of musicians who played in leading orchestras throughout Eastern and Western Europe as well around that same time period. What I think is important is how there's a lot we can say about the history of the people and the history of the texts, but we don't know a lot about the history of the music. A lot of what we learn about the music is inferred, and Merav spends a really wonderful time looking at this in many different ways. And many of the melodies that are heard in this tradition are what we could say are borrowed melodies, or melodies that are really coming from the Arab and Turkish milieu and environment, and then adapted and created and really imagined in new ways. And one of the fascinating things I find about this tradition that Merav so nicely unfolds for us is how this particular tradition is, she provides this wonderful musical example and talks about how tunes within the community are borrowed amongst themselves. This is a comparison of Yehiyu Kamotz Ovidei Kamosh and Baruch Kelchai El Kelnu and Elokeinu. And what you could see is that if you look in the left and the right, that you see the first melody of those notes being used the same, but comparatively, so you could see it pictorially, is that the blue boxes are the same melody, but shaped a little differently. The purple box is the red box. And this really goes throughout the song. So within the tradition, one is taking the melody and then repurposing the melody. So it's not that one melody has one purpose, but a melody can have multiple purposes and can be used in many different ways. And I think that's a really interesting aspect of this tradition in this community. The important thing to talk about in terms of music is the makam. Makam is really understood as sort of the core musical entity. It's really a little too reductive to simply call it a scale, but it's often thought of as a scale, but it's a set of notes, a set of phrases and meaning that's really put into the music. Merav shows how in the 1906 publication, there are 15 different makamat that are used, but in the 1954 publication, there are 7 more, or 22 makamat that are used. So this really shows how this practice is not a unitary practice. It's not just about looking at the past. It's really about taking and developing this tradition and the very dynamic nature of the music and the environment in the Ottoman period, in the Ottoman arena, in the Arab world, that the music is growing and it's adapting. And one of the important things to really mention about that is how in this particular music, that makam attribute is really significant. So I won't go into the technical details, but we could see in here of the 22 different makamat that they each have their own designation of what notes they start on, where they stop, and then the different aspects of that. Is the E or the B a half flat, a full flat? Is the F sharp or not? There are all these different, very subtle arrangements of the notes that really become very significant. And as Merav lists throughout the book, the makam is associated with the appearance. So when the text is written and there's a melody that's attributed to, people know what makam that's in. So the makam gives it a very important identity. And one of the aspects that's interesting is the affect that's given. And Merav has a really beautiful quote about how someone really talks about how makam saba is done for sadness, makam Husseini is done for a very happy way. And that's true in Arabic music in general. It's very interesting that in the Aleppo tradition that saba is used for circumcision and the sad makam is hijaz. They're just really different Jewish traditions related to this. So this really reflects sort of this pan-Arab tradition as it works in this Arab context. So I don't need to screen share anymore. So again, sorry for all my fumbles, but just to conclude, I just want to conclude with 5 different ideas to really extend the work of Merav. And one is the first of my 5 final points is, well, my points will focus around boundaries, blending, and hybridity. First of my 5 points is habitus. This concept that the tradition is a part of a regular practice. The tradition is really something that people live in, work in. It's not just one thing that they do, but the people who are singing this tradition to make it current, to make it alive, that they're in many ways, the cultural boundaries that we say Arab or Jewish, in many ways just don't apply because it's just what they do. It's really part of their habitus. It's just the things that they're doing. Point number 2. The paraliturgical song is really not tefillah per se, but it's close. So it's not governed by the practices of what's halakhically required. So it has a little more flexibility, but it's still a sacred expression. It's still a religious tradition that is really a significant part and uniquely part of Jews from the Arab lands, Jews of the Arab communities, where paraliturgical song is a very defining aspect of who they are. Number 3, the adaptability of this musical tradition is really so important because it really just shows how the music is a living organism. It's just not about remaining static. You want to keep certain practices from the past alive, but they're always being renewed. Music is being recycled. It's really being made new. And that's, I think, a very important thing to look at Merav's work as a really important snapshot in time, that as time will go on, we can refer to and see how these practices are developing by the different communities. This aspect of Judeo-Arab synthesis or commensality, as Noam has said, Merav beautifully narrates us through this wonderful aspect of these ways in which things are together. And there's a very beautiful quote that she has that I'd love to read from someone from towards the end of the book. It says, "In fact, their identity reflects a deep notion that they, as Jews living in the Arabo-Islamic diaspora, felt Jewish enough to be Arabs too. That this fact that both can exist, it's not an either or, it's not a bifurcation, but it's an integration of these two different ideas. So we can see that the past and present is always at play, the way that the past texts that are born from biblical ideas, rabbinic ideas, Kabbalistic imagery is all woven into these texts that has many layers of meaning, but the music helps to realize this attitude, this synthesis, these particular ideas. So the music helps us sort of be in the moment. And there's this very beautiful idea that Merav, I know one of her important teachers was Habib Tuma, and Habib Tuma is a really important scholar talking about Arab music. And the way that he talks folding of a maqam is that you start and give a basic idea, which means in the lower part of the maqam, and you give a little more of the idea, and you slowly expand the sound world. The sound world starts increasing. You may switch to a different maqam. You come back to maqam. The integration of that maqam, which gives it a sense of wholeness and gives it a sense of unity, is really about how the music are connected. Sometimes they may seem disconnected, get emotively from the text, may not always directly be in the music, but the whole essence of the music is to put you in an emotional space that is inspired by the words. And that leads to something that's called tarab in Arabic, or maybe what we would call in Hebrew, dvekut, that experience of going beyond yourself. And if you ever have the opportunity to be a part of these singing experiences through bakashot or through this singing, it's a way where time just, has a different sense of meaning, where you're able to just hear this music in the words, and just in some ways, the logical, emotional things just really blend into such a beautiful experience. So I just want to end by saying to Merav, thank you for just this wonderful book that I think is really inspiring to really see this tradition. And through this wonderful work, the music of the tradition that you so dearly love will be continued, and just wish you much continued success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Kligman, and for the very interesting and enjoyable presentation.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Merav, for the honor of inviting me to speak at this celebration honoring your remarkable achievement in writing Judaism and Islam, One God, One Music. I have to tell the rest of my audience that I feel a little bit like one of the Hebrew midwives, Shifra and Pua, in speaking about this work, because I was, to a certain extent, one of the midwives of this work. I was one of Merav's fellow PhD students at the time, and I think we all accompanied the groanings of giving birth to these great works. Merav's was a considerably greater work, I have to say, than my own at the time, but it's been a wonderful thing to live alongside and see the emergence of this extraordinary piece of scholarship. And while it's a great honor, I have to say it's a rather nerve-wracking event here, because I have to admit immediately in this very distinguished company, particularly in the company of our previous two distinguished speakers, that I am not a specialist either in Judaism or in Islam, or indeed in music. I am a Christian theologian who has at various times of her life helped to construct or direct the liturgy in contexts as different as the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, where I was a member of the choir, and the largest women's prison in Europe, where I was the choir. The fact that I am not a specialist does not prevent me from having strong opinions about liturgy and paraliturgy. In my own circles, the question is often asked, what is the difference between a liturgist and a terrorist? And the answer is, well, you can negotiate with a terrorist. I hope to subject no one here to a rant inspired by liturgical extremism of any sort. Instead, I want to offer the warmest possible praise and appreciation of this remarkable book from the perspective of someone who stands outside the traditions of Judaism and Islam, with the affection and admiration of a sister in the Abrahamic faith, with an immense longing to see the children of Abraham bound together in bonds of mutual respect and hope, united by the desire to give glory to God, who is the Father and Creator of us all. Meaning is a human construction, which means that it's inevitably embedded within the master narratives of the dominant culture from which it emerges. Meaning, however, is a slippery commodity. We can take the same tradition and mold it according to our own agendas and intentions. Merav's book does us an immense service by revealing the ancient roots of paraliturgical song, which takes the form of Hebrew religious poems expressing Jewish values and ethics, but mixed with Arabo-Islamic features. We know that in all religious traditions, including Christianity, words express the longing for and the appreciation of the sacred. And these have been set to familiar secular tunes. This is the backbone of the Reformed Christian hymn singing tradition in Britain, as it is within the liturgical and paraliturgical traditions of Middle Eastern Judaism. What we have in this book, however, is far more than an ethnographic, folkloristic approach to this important aspect of a very ancient and embedded symbiosis that unites Jewish and Islamic liturgical traditions and therefore spiritual traditions. I would wish to express here my own sense of the urgency of this book, not simply as a work which reveals the history and development of Jewish paraliturgical song, but one which offers us a powerful way through the rewriting of history for purposes that have been anything but peaceful. In contradiction to the exclusivist and nationalistic ideologies that inform some of the current narratives of both Jewish and Islamic history, there is an appreciation in this book of the cultural and literary traditions of the broad sweep of Middle Eastern Judaism, which I believe as an outsider is of huge significance and which is largely unknown to a Western European audience. Merav's attempt to revive the lost Judeo-Arabic literary and paraliturgical tradition will, I think, make a significant contribution to the dialogue between Judaism and Islam, and therefore, hopefully, of Christianity as well, which will move forward the process towards peace and reconciliation that is longed for by people, all people of goodwill. Jürgen Habermas claims that every act of worship represents some kind of crossing of the divine human boundary, the two movements recognizable in every cultic manifestation. Well, we are a generation now that prides itself on being without boundaries. This is seen as an emancipation from age-old dependencies, but in fact, I believe that our loss of a sense of our historical roots has left many of us largely in a spiritual and philosophical wilderness where we wander around without maps and with little sense of direction. Hans-Georg Gadamer claimed that where there is no horizon, there is no place of meaning. The music and lyrics of our traditions of worship offer us both a horizon and a meaning. The liturgist Bridget Nichols attests that in the liturgy, performance of the rite is instrumental in placing the congregation in a threshold position with respect to the kingdom of God. The songs propose the kingdom, as it were. They propose the reign of God, as opposed to the reign of this world and its values and anti-values. Whether these songs are in formal liturgy or have become subsumed into family and informal rituals, they nevertheless propose a world where God, and not human ambitions and compulsions, is both the horizon of our longings and the driving force by which we seek to reach them. The aim of liturgy is to take us to the boundary of our known world. The sound of the human voice becomes a dimension of the meanings which the language is carrying. The triumph of rationalistic ideologies, distinguishing spirit and matter as independent and separate entities, potentially fosters a damaging dualism which drives religion into the exclusive domain of the spirit, shutting people off from their bodies into a so-called spiritual realm. Bodily infleshed prayer is judged by those driven by these ideologies as primitive. According to Max Weber, disenchantment is one of the most significant characteristics of the postmodern era. Ours, indeed, is the first major civilization to attempt to distance itself from all religious dependencies and make redundant the religious impulse out of which they spring. Looking from a different perspective, the 20th century French Jesuit liturgist, Father Joseph Gélineau, wrote that the purpose of singing and music is to awake meaning and induce an attitude. The liturgy is the shared activity of people gathered together. Many individual voices can be fused together so that when they blend and follow the same rhythm, only one voice is heard. This brings out a very strong feeling of unity and belonging. Gelino goes on to say that it even touches on the essential mystery of the church, the gathered faith community, as koinonia, as community. Amid, he says, the great diversity of rites, languages, and cultures within Christianity, music remains a privileged meeting point. Well, he sees that from the perspective of global Christianity, but how much more meaning is awoken, how much more of a vital attitude for us to go forward in the future is awoken when liturgy and paraliturgy are a shared activity of peoples gathered together, many individual voices fused together, blending and following the same rhythm, so that indeed only one voice is heard. Any work that can shed light on the development of paraliturgical song, both in melody and in lyrics, as a sublime coming together and enrichment of cultures, rather than a clash of rival faiths and ideologies, is to be welcomed and treasured. The harmonious hybridization or convivencia of Jewish and Arabo-Islamic ascetics and ideas contradicts any notion of a fundamental incompatibility of these two great faiths and cultural traditions. Merav's book reminds me of the Psalm of Ascents, Psalm 133, which says, "How good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity." A further translation of this psalm gives this as, "How good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in harmony." Well, harmony is precisely what we have in this work and this music. I'm delighted to have been invited to reflect on the ways in which this book has added to the project of harmony between some of the world's great faith traditions. May the God of Abraham and Sarah, who are our parents in faith, bless this book and this harmony with success. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma.
Thank you, Gemma, very much for your I was really touched by your presentation.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to congratulate Dr. Merav on her book. I hope I'm going to be able to read it because my English is not so good with all these fancy words. As you said, I used to be the Hazan of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef for many, many years. My name is Yeḥezqel Zion. Zion is not really an Iraqi last name. My original last name is Sona. Sona, probably my father was from Turkey originally. My mother is, the family is Sharabani, a very famous and big family in Baghdad. My name, Yeḥezqel, I was called after Chacham Yeḥezqel Zluf. They used to call him Chacham Yeḥezqel al-Waqil. He used to be the manager of Bet Zlicha. It's a Talmud Torah, like yeshiva of more than 1,000 students. We're going to start with the song Ozi Elecha Eshmora. By the way, I would like to thank Dr. Merav that, you know, I'm Hazan in the Syrian community, but it's such a pleasure for me to go back to my roots as a Baghdadi and to sing all these songs. And we're going to sing the song Ozi Elecha Eshmora. I think the one that wrote these songs is Rabbi Abdallah Khadir Hanin. The maqam is Maqam Hajaz. Ozi Elecha Eshmora.
Ozi Elecha Eshmora. شبت قدشك منورا كي على عمك برختك ميدك عاشرا زخير بطوبك ذكرا لعودك بحارة عيني لبي روحي حي فاعولك عيني لبي روحي حي وأشر لك بك هالأمونيم ونقول بورنا نمويز مرام.
Thank you very much. The next song we're going to sing, the song the Rorira that everybody knows, and I believe that there is so many versions to this song from all over. I'm going to sing, of course, the version of the Iraqi Jews. One of them, the rabbi that wrote this song is Rabbi Dunash Halevi Ibn Labrat. He was poetic and a commentator to the Torah in the Golden Age. And we're going to sing this song with a little bit of the playback in the background. You can join me if it's possible, I don't know.
ناعم شمخ ولو يشبت شوم بنوح بيوم شبت.
As you know, I used to be the Hazan of Chacham Ovadia Yosef for many, many, many years. And of course, he sent me here to the United States to be the Hazan in the Syrian community. I'm already in the same synagogue, Bet Torah, over 30 years. And of course, every time that I used to come and visit Israel, and it happened at least 3-4 times a year, I used to come visit him. My mother, Ala Shalom, used to live the apartment on top of Chacham Ovadia. So for me to come home is also to come to Chacham Ovadia. I remember Shabbatot, I used to eat by him. And one Shabbat, I remember he brought his grandson, used to sit on his lap, and he started singing, as we called, Shbahot. And I immediately, for me, it was, again, I'm not so much singing this Shbahot recently because of the Kehillah here. And I started singing with him, and he told me, how do you know all this Shbahot? I never heard you sing this. So I told him, I remember his father. They used to claim Galle Galle because all the time he used to sing the Shbahot of all the occasion with Chacham Ovadia. He used to come and sing before Chacham Ovadia started to sing. Now we're going to sing the song. The next song is Shefal Ruach. This song is really one of the songs that makes me so much emotional because of the words and the tune, of course, but seeing how the Chachamim of those days used to, especially the Sephardim, used to be so humbled and writing. This song was written by Rabbi Shlomo Ibn Gebirol.
كيف الروح شف البرخ وكما أكدم خابر فحد وإمام لفني خاني نحشب بعيني كتلاتك تنبى أدما شف الروح شف البرخ وكما أكدم خابر فحد وإمام.
There is another song that Chacham Ovadia used to love and many times participate singing with us, of course in Hebrew, song in Arabic called Inta Zaman of Abdul Wahab, the Maqam Kurd, and the song in Hebrew called Eli Ba Zaman. Eli Ba Zaman نسمع بنجيل Eli Ba Zaman نسمع بنجيل We're going to end up last song from the Egyptian songs is the very famous song of Kulthum, Inta Umri. So the song in Arabic they call it Inta Umri, but the beginning of the song is Raga'uni Alek. And my brother wrote the words of Rega'im Emne, as much as we can to be, closer to the Arabic. Rega'im Emne Miyom Le'om Atayashu Kolilo عنني راحم ذيحان والميخوط أذي شيبة ملكية عود ميخوط النبي تكون عليا والمخوطة هذه شيبة ملكية عود مخوط بيت نبي تكون وزراح عليا أنا إلي حيدك يا مو بنت بتشلاح حيدك يا مو بنت بتشلاح
Yeḥezqel, I wanted to tell you something. One of the participants here is a pure Egyptian. Yani he's looking at you now and he's checking, is this the right sound? May I say your name?
Oh, thank you.
It's Mohammed Hawali. He's here from Cairo. And I looked.
Oh, that's so
face,
beautiful.
and he's examining you if you are in the maqam or not. But judging by his face, he's quite pleased. So, Chazak Baruch.
Wow, thank you very much.
Now, let me invite the bride of this celebration, Dr. Merav Rosenfeld-Hadad. She wants to say a few words. So, Merav, please.
Thank you, Chaya. I realize that you are too tired, so I'll try to be very short.
No, I'm fine. I'm fine. Everything is fine.
So, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone. I wish to thank the Chaim Herzog Center for Middle Eastern Diplomacy at Ben Gurion University of the Negev for impeccable hospitality. I particularly wish to thank the organizers of this wonderful event, Dr. Orit Vaknik-Yekutieli, Chair of the Chaim Herzog Center, Dr. Chaya Bambadis to support us, as you can see, the moving force of this occasion, and Tal Sela, who took care of all the nitty-gritty which are needed for this virtual yet very rich and wonderful event. I wish to thank the speakers for their stimulating and interesting talks and for the great honor they gave me by saying this kind words. Thank you, Professor Noam Stillman, not only for being today, you are in Jerusalem at the moment, but not only of giving this wonderful talk, but for you are the source of inspiration for everything I know about Jewish history. And I remember myself as a PhD student reading, I'm a product of the Israeli education system, and I never learned about the history of the Jews of Arab countries. All I knew is the stories about that I told about my parents, about this beautiful and rich culture. And all of a sudden, it took me to cross the ocean to get a PhD in Cambridge and to see your books and feel, thank God, I'm at home again. Someone knows all about it. And it really opened my eyes and my heart. And I was so excited to read that. And since then, as Professor Kligman says, whenever you need something, the books are here, you open them and you know exactly where you are. I wish to thank Professor Mark Kligman in Los Angeles, who had to wake up very early today. Thank you, Mark, and I particularly appreciate your work because, again, when I read your PhD, I remember I read your PhD about the Halabi Jews and the way you understood the maqam and you understood the way they use it. You understand what happened in their mind and in their heart when they actually sing the maqam. I felt again at home that thank God there is someone who really understands what is going on. And I wish to thank Dr. Gemma Simmonds in Cambridge, UK. With her and with a group of theologians, very close friends, we are for many, many years not only discussing interfaith relations, but actually doing it halacha l'maaseh, de facto, and discussing the similarities and differences between Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Many thanks to Cantor Yeḥezqel Zion in Brooklyn, New York, for his wonderful performance. I wish to thank the Baghdadi-born Australian artist, Mr. Saif Salman, who also had to wake up very early today for his wonderful illustration that appears on the cover of the book and expresses a very central aspect of the Jewish Paraliturgical Songs, which is called Babylonian Jews Shbachos, and by the Syrian Jews Pizmonim. Last but not least, I wish to thank you, the audience, friends and colleagues, and many other people who have gathered from near and far to take part in this event. So, toda rabba, shukran, and thank you very much to all of you. I think it's, I would say a few words about the book. It's time to say something about it. So, this book is dedicated to my parents who inspired me with their noble spirits and lives to write this work, which reflects the fruitful coexistence that Jews and Muslims shared in the past. So what is the Paraliturgical song? I know there are all sorts of terms for this. In Israel, it is called Piyyut. And if I have time, I will say why I'm not happy with this term. So the Paraliturgical song is a Hebrew religious poem expressing Jewish values and ethics, which is mixed with idiosyncratic Arabo-Islamic poetic features of form, style, and content. This rich poem is frequently set to a melody of an already existing Arabic song and is typically sang at Jewish private and communal occasions, such as the Sabbath meals and wedding celebrations, respectively. The texts of this genre are documented in many collections that have been published over the course of many centuries by Jewish communities in Arab countries, including the Babylonian Jews. And the melodies, on the other hand, were always orally transmitted and were never documented in any kind of notation. And here is the problem, because everything to do with reality is immediately turned to be folkloristic, shallow, and all sorts of unflattering descriptions. So in my book, I go beyond the ethnographic folkloristic approach that has prevailed so far in the study of this genre by shifting the focus from its oral aspects to its written sources. And based on these sources, I explore the historical, religious, and cultural context of the genre and its people within their wider cultural environment. In this wider cultural environment and as a part of this cultural environment. To that, I took two of the most important collections. This of the 1906 that was published by Ezra Dangur. I have it here with me. It's a part of the books that my grandfather brought with him from Baghdad, very ancient book. In this book, there is a very interesting introduction of the genre as such and its merits, etc., which I explore in my book. And I took the 1954 collection of songs published in 1954, only a few years after the massive immigration of the Jews of Iraq to Israel. The second one has a little bit less songs, but he also includes songs that were written in between this time, between 1906 and the middle of the 20th century. And here again, this book from the library of my grandfather, this is the book. So I treated these sources with some more smaller collections of the genres that were published in Baghdad in the 19th century and first half of the 20th century, and treated these religious sources as actually historical sources. And I was trying to see what I can learn from them in terms of the history of the genre and of course its culture, etc. But I had a serious problem. Why? Because most of the songs that appear in this collection appear without the names of their authors. So I had to embark on a, how should I call it, detective project to find out the names of it. And I was very, very pleased to find 70% of the songs 70% of the songs authors in different smaller collection. And this journey was by itself a very interesting journey. So I took all these names and I organized them in an order of time and place. And lo and behold, this is what I found. 1,000 years of history. It all started in the 10th century in Abbasid Baghdad, and why I say Abbasid Baghdad, although it is represented by Yunash Ben Lebrat, who decided to travel from Fez to Baghdad to study at the feet of Saadia Gaon, everything that he learned from him, by the way, Saadia Gaon is described beautifully in Yosef Tobi's book, and say that Saadia Gaon was the first Jewish spiritual leader opens the door of Judaism to the influence of the Arabo-Islamic culture in a very generous way. So Dunash studies at the feet of Saadia Gaon. He learned from him, for example, one of the things that Saadia Gaon loved is that the Muslim poets used the Quran as a source of vocabulary and inspiration for their poetry. He said, well, our Bible is no less beautiful, so let's put this source in our poetry as well. So he adopt this thing, he adopt the meter and many things. He writes the first Qasida, and with this training, he moves to Muslim Spain. Muslim Spain is covered in this collection between the 11th and the 15th century, and you can see this wonderful and important scholars, poets who are not only leading poets in Hebrew religious poetry, but they are leading in other branches of Jewish scholarship, Ibn Gabirol, Yehuda Levi, Avraham ibn Hezra, and all this group. And there is also a song by Maimonides, which we are not sure that it is. But nevertheless, there are still very important and leading figures in this period. And then across the Ottoman Empire, again, we have poets from North Africa, from literally everywhere. And this is the time to remind Professor Stillman about the fact that I know him during my PhD, because I remember when I first found out about all those North African poets, and you have to remember, as I said, in Israel, we didn't learn anything about them. So I emailed Professor Stillman and I said, can you help me with this? He said, Merav, email Professor Maman in Bar Ilan and he will tell you everything. And lo and behold, Professor Maman opened for me a magical world of the North African rabbis and poets. And I was so pleased to see, I mean, from this you can also learn about the relationship between the different communities from North Africa to Baghdad. This poetry arrived and practiced in the Babylonian community. Fascinating. So that was very interesting and new discovery for me. So, and the fourth period is Baghdad again, although it's still under the Ottoman Empire, but again with substantial number of Baghdadi poets who were also rabbis, and they are led by Chacham Yosef Chaim ben Eliyahu Chacham, who, by the way, now I found the two songs. So he has 52 songs in this collection. So altogether, what I found here is a history of 1,000 years. And I revealed the strong presence of the Arabo-Islamic culture in both the text and music of the genre, as well as in the lives of the poets. And what I saw is that throughout these long centuries, for various reasons, the paraliturgical song became a free and open channel which absorbed Arabo-Islamic cultural trends, amalgamated them with Jewish values, and thereby created hybridization of Jewish and Arabo-Islamic religions and cultures. Although the poets were influenced by their cultural ambiance and amalgamated aspects of its aesthetics and ideas in their poetry, their Jewish identity was beyond any doubt or question. It seems that this combination of cultures was both inspiring and enriching. And I had the great honor to interview Baghdadi Jews who practice this genre both in Baghdad and in Israel. Allah yarhamhum, most of them are not with us anymore. But what I realized from their descriptions is that they felt strongly about their Jewish identity, but at the same time and with the same enthusiasm, they expressed their love for Arabo-Islamic culture. This combination survived the long centuries of diasporic life and life later on in Israel. And it was and still is emblematic and typical of the religio-cultural life, not only of the Babylonian Jew, but also of many other communities of Jews originating in Arab countries. I want to thank you so much for your patience and to wish you all best. I'm sorry I didn't have time to talk more about the music and the practice itself, what is so typical to Middle Eastern and North African Judaism, which is a very accommodating and hugging Judaism. Everything is possible, everything is welcome, nothing is out of reach. As long as you have your strong identity as Jew, you can take everything you want and bring it to your Jewishness in a harmonious way without any contradiction or feeling that it's not yours. Everything is most welcome. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Merav. Just stop the share screen so that we can see each other. So thank you very much to all the participants, to all the friends that I saw here. I saw friends from United States, from Oxford, from Dublin, from, I don't know, many familiar faces and unfamiliar faces for me. But Daphne Dori, I see you, Avi Schlein, wow. It's very nice to see you, Rivka Kadosh. So really, thank you all of you. Thank you very much. And Yona Abudor from Morocco is now from Morocco. So it demonstrates I think the issue itself. So I wish you, Merav, many book launches in the future, very productive work. I wish you all very good health. We are celebrating very soon the Passover here, so Pesach Kasher to all of us. God bless you. Alayhi chalikum. Thank you very much. Good evening.
يعرف ديباش على لشون خليبانا خليبانا عربوا لي شيره غيونك تصحي لي شوشنا